Issue 4, Belarus.
President Alexander Lukashenko of Belarus this week requested Russian security assistance in putting down nationwide protests. Belarusians have taken to the streets every day since an August 9th election, which they allege Lukashenko rigged. International observers agree that the election was neither free nor fair. But with Russia now moving to consolidate its neighbor and ally, some European officials fear a redo of the 2014 Russian incursion into Ukraine.
James, from the Russian perspective, Belarus obviously a critical part of the orbit. President Putin very unlikely to let that cede in a Western direction. At the same time, NATO countries concerned that if Russia is to usurp Belarus, as President Putin has been interested in doing, then you would have the Baltic states and Poland, those NATO members, right on the side of a Russian compression force. So how do you see the geopolitical ramifications of this issue?
It's very difficult to see anything constructive coming out of this side of the election, I think. In fact, I think anybody who's expecting anything, even like a rebuke of Putin from this president in Washington, hasn't been paying attention for the past 4 years. But lest that sound unnecessarily partisan, let me suggest that anybody who's been expecting any pushback against Russian interference in its own backyard from the United States hasn't been paying attention for the last 8 years and arguably longer, because as your piece rightly pointed out there, Barack Obama basically stepped back and did very little with regards to the Russian incursion into Ukraine, which of course caused all kinds of consternations when that occurred. I think that generally speaking, Vladimir Putin has been playing the West for fools for far too long. Every year, Time magazine puts its person of the year forward, and it always astonishes me that Putin doesn't win time and again. Not because, of course, I have any great love for the man, but simply because he's been such an effective leader of that country and keeping the West at bay, quite frankly. It's been nice to think that things would change when Trump leaves office, as and when that happens, but I think there's very little to suggest that there's evidence to support such wishful thinking.
Eleanor, your thoughts?
I'd like to point out that the Senate Intelligence Committee released a nearly 1,000-page report this week, basically detailing numerous contacts between the Trump campaign officials and Russian officials, including a top intelligence person in Russia, very close to Putin. So the notion that this was all a hoax, the Russian probe was a hoax, has been put to bed by Republicans. And when we look at the various Russian republics, none of them have really emerged with what we would call thriving democracies after the breakup of the Soviet Empire. But I'm not in the business of condoning poisoning people who are running against you, and I think we ought to point that out, that we've had the opposition candidate in Russia, apparently the victim of a poison attack. And if you Google Russia, poison, whatever, right, you come up with a list of 10 or 12 people who have suffered the same fate just recently. And I remember that interview with President Trump when the interviewer, he was praising Putin, and the interviewer said, but he kills people. And Trump said, well, so do we.
Right. Pat, your thoughts on Belarus, on Navalny, on the Russia issue at large?
All right, let's begin with Belarus. Lukashenko is finished. It's a matter of time before he goes. His population doesn't want him there. And so I think he's going to go. I think Putin has a real problem here. I don't think Vladimir Putin has any desire to send troops into Belarus the way Brezhnev sent them into Czechoslovakia in '68. And it seems to me the possibilities for the West are good here. Now let's talk about Navalny. I find it hard to believe that Putin would do this, because Navalny dead as a martyr is far more dangerous to Putin than Navalny alive. And Navalny apparently was also criticizing Lukashenko. So I don't know who did it, but I think Putin's got a real problem on his hands if this man dies, because the West will be forced, I think, to virtually put sanctions, demand an investigation. And if Putin doesn't respond to it, I think they almost have to put new sanctions on him. And Putin doesn't want that. He wants out of the sanctions he got for Ukraine. So I think James has a good point, but I think the great man's luck might have run out here.
So for once, Pat and I agree on Russia. Perhaps not on Crimea Bridge, but at least on that
I
issue.
do too.
Clarence, your thoughts?
Well, I agree with Pat as far as Lukashenko's days being numbered. The question is, though, as far as Navalny is concerned, if Putin didn't do it, who did? I feel better knowing that that Putin, murderer that he is in more command of that sort of bad news in Russia than to say that this happened when he did not want it. And that's something that, well, we've seen this with journalists in the past who've been either killed or driven into exile. Putin has such a long reputation for this. That's why he's in a position now where there's pressure on him to have more sanctions imposed. So it's still a worrisome situation.
So let's thread this out a little bit, James. You've obviously written quite a lot of, two at least excellent books in terms of democratic foreign policy strategy. How do you see the prospect of a Biden presidency dealing with Europe? Because as much as, yes, there is this acrimony between European leaders and President Trump, there is also this divide in terms of NATO spending, in terms of disagreements on a wide number of issues that perhaps will extend beyond a President Trump.
Yeah, there's no doubt about that, Tom. It's very clear that what Donald Trump has done is just change the tone, if not the content, because successive American presidents have been urging America's NATO allies in particular to pay a greater degree of its GDP towards its own defense. You and I have both spent time in England, and we are aware of the social services that are available there. And it always used to gripe me, quite frankly, that an awful lot of people in Europe were very happy to mock America for its what they thought of as excessive defense spending, whilst basically relying upon the state to support it through its social security, not realizing, of course, that Europeans' defense policy was basically being propped up by the United States. Basically, the United States was providing a nuclear umbrella throughout the Cold War that Europe simply wasn't paying for from an American point of view. So if indeed Donald Trump does lose in November and we get a President Biden, expect, I think, a sigh of relief, frankly, for many people in Europe, just because Donald Trump will be gone. However, the underlying long-term national interests of the United States will remain, and they include getting her allies to pay far more for their security in an attempt to reduce the defense expenditure here in the United States.
Yeah. Whether you think the NATO members pay enough or pay too little, everything Trump has done has divided the allies and made Putin happy. The division and rancor among the NATO allies is exactly what he wants. So yes, if Biden is elected, I think that automatically strengthens NATO, and I think that's a good thing. And Biden knows a lot of these leaders; he's known them for a long time. I'm not worried about foreign policy under Biden, not in the least.
Clarence, one of the things on Russia, I mean, President Trump speaks affectionately of President Putin often, but in terms of policy, on the intelligence operations side, the CIA has, though it's not really reported, has a lot more leniency to be a lot more aggressive against the Russians. Energy policy, Democrats proposing a ban on fracking, which Putin is very much in favor of. In Ukraine, before the phone call, anti-tank weapons. President Trump's record on Russia, I think one could quite compellingly say that what he says is not necessarily what his administration does, and that on that does factor, tougher than President Obama. What say you?
Well, you could say that about Trump's domestic policy as well. He talks tough, and he loves to shake that big stick, but when push comes to shove, he tends to cave. And I think in dealing with Putin, I oftentimes think that our foreign policy is being run out of the Kremlin. It's just that close of a relationship. And Trump is still thinking of Putin and Russia in terms of what kind of transaction can he pull off next. And sometimes he gets a good deal. Sometimes he gets the short end, but he will always brag about it.
Pat, you get the concluding word.
Well, let me say this. I think the American people themselves are pretty fed up with having carried the load for the Europeans for some 70 years now. And they were quite willing at the end of the Cold War for the Europeans to take more responsibility. Trump is in line with the heart of the American people. And let me tell you, if Putin should move into Belarus and when it breaks down or something like that, or there's some kind of revolution, there will be no sign in the United States for sending a lot of troops to Poland or to Eastern Europe. I think the NATO alliance is very much a paper alliance. Underneath it is not what existed there in 1960 and 1970.
Okay. And Clarence, because you're the veteran, and I'm being told we have a little bit more time, why don't you give us 45 seconds on that point? Alliances or whatever you fancy.
Well, the funny thing about President Trump is he doesn't seem to, he's not a multilateralist. He's not America first. He thinks in terms of our unilateral interests. And so that's why he doesn't get along so well with relations like NATO and other alliances that he did not set up himself. So I think if we don't have Trump around after this next election, we're going to find a lot of these arrangements will be repaired.